Welcome everyone around the country to the first podcast of the National Treaty Alliance, which is an unincorporated association of First Nations Australians and their supporters who believe in the development of a treaty between the First Nations and non-Aboriginal Australia as the best way forward in addressing serious disadvantage and in Aboriginal communities. I'd like to just say briefly that many people around the country and communities don't have the opportunity to review literature or see newspapers or see the media. So we'll be sending out this broadcast to a wide audience, and hopefully we can encourage debate and discussion in the community around what sort of proposals become part of a treaty for First Nations Australians with non-Aboriginal Australia. Without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Nulsa to do an acknowledgement of country.
Yeah, thanks, Kuch. Well, first of all, I'd like to acknowledge, or we should acknowledge what a major countries where this podcast has been done. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we work and live. We also extend the respect to other Indigenous Australians who are present and listening to our podcast online. Thank you.
I'd like to introduce Michael Mansell, who needs no introduction.
Thanks, Yapalingana. My name is Michael Mansell. I'm currently the chairman of the Aboriginal Land Council of Tasmania. I'm also a lawyer. I've been heavily involved in the National Treaty Alliance since early in 2022. The reason for the Treaty Alliance is because if you look at the history of Aboriginal aspirations about a treaty, when Malcolm Fraser was Prime Minister back in the 70s, the first national Aboriginal body, the National Aboriginal Conference, called for a treaty, and the Prime Minister at the time said he was willing to talk about a treaty. Fast forward another 10 years and the councils of Aboriginal organisations in Alice Springs, the Central Australian organisations, I should say, called for a national treaty in 1983. When Bill Shorten led the Labor Party in 2016, he said he was willing to talk about a treaty. And of course, with the recent impetus in 2017 with the Uluru Statement, of which treaty is an essential component, and the subsequent statement by the current Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, that all parts of the Uluru Statement will be implemented in full. And what he meant was that includes a treaty and truth-telling and Aboriginal sovereignty as well as voice, gives us that extra incentive to expand this National Treaty Alliance around the country and involve as many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as we can. The work of the Treaty Alliance is either complicated or not complicated, depending on what happens with the voice. For example, if the Commonwealth Government decide to set up a voice now, then they could also establish a treaty commission within 6 months of establishing the voice. But if the voice can only be established through the Constitution, the process becomes very complicated, very messy, and very expensive. And as we know, the federal government have set aside $75 million to promote the voice through a referendum, but have only given $1.9 million per year for the establishment of a treaty commission, which brings me to my main point. If the government is going to establish two things during its term of office, that is, the voice and a treaty commission, it can do that very simply through legislation, and both can be established by mid-2023. However, if they intend to establish the voice through a referendum, because that is so complicated and because it is such a big event, it stands to reason that this particular government will only deal with either the voice or a treaty during its term of office. They will not run a referendum and also establish a treaty commission, not during their term of office. So that raises the question for us, which gets priority if we know in political reality the federal government are only going to do one or the other? Well, let's just have a very quick run through of the difference between the voice and the treaty as we all understand it. First of all, the purpose of the voice is simply to comment or give advice. A treaty delivers a package of rights to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. A second difference is the area of operation. The voice, because it is a creature of the federal parliament, could only comment on federal legislation as it was being developed. On the other hand, a treaty binds all state governments, all territory governments, it binds the courts, it binds the police and the public, and binds all other people in the country. And the reason for that is because if a national treaty is legislated by the federal parliament, it has the force of a federal law which overrides the states. Of course, there are limitations on both models. The glaring ones for the voice is that the voice cannot return any land to Aboriginal people. It cannot deliver any services to Aboriginal people. It cannot raise any funds, nor can it distribute any funds. All it does is give advice. On the other hand, a treaty delivers Crown lands to Aboriginal people without having to go through the formal process of a native title. Secondly, it gives a form of power, a sharing of power between the Commonwealth and the states and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And thirdly, it would provide some form of reparation, whether in the form of a financial guarantee of an annual resource or by some other means. It has been said that the voice is uncertain as to its detail, and that is one of its failings. But the same comment could be made about a treaty, because people would say, well, how do you know that Crown lands are going to be returned to Aboriginal people? Well, you wouldn't have a treaty if Crown lands weren't returned to Aboriginal people. How do you know Aboriginal people are going to be sharing power? Well, you wouldn't have a treaty if we weren't sharing power. If Aboriginal people were not given an independent guarantee of resource, you wouldn't have a treaty. So, yes, there are discussions about how much land would come back. There are discussions about what would the size of the amount of money that would be set aside for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. But those fundamental elements would have to be included in a treaty, otherwise you wouldn't have a treaty. Another difference between the voice and a treaty is the empowerment element. The voice it is said that the voice is being established because Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people do not have a voice in the federal parliament. Well, that ignores the fact that there are 10 Indigenous representatives in the federal parliament at the moment who can participate in the debate and vote on any legislation that goes up. And while I'm on the point, I mention the number 10, not 11, because Jackie Lambie, despite the claims, has no Aboriginal heritage and is not Aboriginal. So there are 10 Indigenous people in the federal parliament. While the voice seeks to advise the federal parliament on any bill that's going before it or wants to give advice to the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, it does not have a veto, a point that was conceded by the Federal Minister Linda Burney in Adelaide in October. Nor could the voice stop another Northern Territory intervention from being legislated again in the Parliament. It can comment on it and it can oppose it, but it can't stop it. In fact, the voice could not even stop the federal Parliament passing legislation to get rid of the voice in the future. It can comment, but it cannot veto the legislation. On the other hand, there are two elements to a treaty that, while the extent of them needs to be negotiated, the two elements must necessarily be a core of the treaty. One is representation at the national level, and the National Treaty Alliance is advocating for one Aboriginal Senate seat in each of the 6 states being set aside for Aboriginal people who would vote in their own delegate, and that person would be answerable every time there's a federal election to that Indigenous electorate. But it wouldn't just be at the national level. A treaty also would we would advocate for the inclusion in a treaty of empowerment at the local level, so that in discrete Aboriginal communities at least, law and order, including policing, would be delivered by the community itself. Housing, health and education would be run by the community itself. The community could raise taxes on land that was returned under a treaty and could demand royalties from any industry that's working on the treaty land area. And the community could also have absolute control over land use and planning. So they are some of the differences between a treaty and a voice. And because, as I was saying, the treaty delivers a package of rights to Aboriginal people, it would be an opportunity too important to miss if we allow the voice and the referendum to be put forward during the term of this government's office, and we defer the treaty process until after the next federal election. I think that would be a terrible mistake. As far as the process of establishing the voice and a treaty, the voice, if it's legislated, is a one-step process. Mr. Albanese can put the legislation into the Parliament and it can be voted through tomorrow. The treaty process is two-step. First of all, Mr. Albanese has to put legislation into the Parliament to establish a treaty commission. The treaty commission would operate for either 18 months or 2 years, bring a report back to the federal Parliament with draft treaty legislation, which then goes back to the Parliament and is voted through to become law. If, on the other hand, the voice is put to a referendum, the process becomes 3-step. You have to have legislation establishing a referendum. Secondly, you have to have a majority of the people in the majority of the states to approve the referendum. And thirdly, if that happens, you've got a third step again, where the Prime Minister has to reintroduce legislation to establish the voice. So from my point of view, the point I'm trying to make is, because there is such a push towards a referendum that unnecessarily complicates matters, that means in itself that only one thing or the other will get up. And if that's the case, we should be pushing for a treaty and not a voice. Thanks everybody for listening.
I just think that the voice, what's been put up there to Parliament, is going to be, I think there is definitely a risk in that whole process there. So because it's long drawn out, and I think it looks like the way it's heading is that the Aboriginal people are leading it up are trying to appease the government. So I don't think with the experience over the last 100 years, 200 years, that never worked, and I don't think it's going to work again. And that's the danger that's going to put us through by holding a referendum and to get knocked back in that them sort of things. But the thing is, I'm definitely not in favour of the voice to Parliament. I think it's dangerous, and like my dad said, we got our own law, and that should be respected. And the thing is that what Michael was just saying there, I think it's just dangerous, myself personally, and that's coming from some of our people.
Nulsa, what about the feeling in your community of Yarrabah around the voice or a treaty?
Well, they came here last year to Yarrabah, and that was look, the people in Yarrabah, there's 2,500 people, 3,000 people, and only about 5 people was invited to that process where the 2 people who were leading that up. And it was a political thing, and none of our people knew about it. The people in Yarrabah didn't know about what was that process called? Affirmation from Yarrabah. That was terrible, and it was deceitful for the people of Yarrabah. So that people out there, especially the Koori people, the Noongais, the Murray people, I think that should be looked in that light, because when they start doing those sort of things, I think we're going to be really wary that these people haven't got their own people at heart. They just like the black colonizers of this country. My dad just turned 100 last fortnight, and he always said there is 2 laws in this country, and we all recognise the white man law, but we also represent. We also got to recognise our law, and he always say that. That's that, and their law, exactly. That's what made us poor in our country. We got a lot of land, but there's no. We starve with funds, and basically it's an economic thing too. But that's what they've been doing over the last 200 years. They stole. We know what they've done, all the history and that. Stole the land, and we end up with bugger all. The thing is, I think what Dad was with the first NAC. He was elected. Back in the days, and he was also active with the bloody 1967 referendum, and he always say that he always talked about a treaty in his own way and that, and nothing, and he was around the days when blokes like Nugget Coombe and that would push it for the Makarrata at that time, and he tells me about that, and what Whitlam done, and especially that speech that was mentioned by Paul Keating, and the thing that where Bob, what's his name? Bob, the Prime Minister, Bob Hawke, where he promised when he was up in the territory there that he's going to push for a treaty, and then he backed out of it. But anyhow, look, the thing is, we as Aboriginal people, we know what we want. We got leaders there, like you guys here on this program here now, like Michael and and Liz and you there, Yabba, the bear. You don't want me calling you that, but the thing is, we and Kuch is always there to work with the mob. But and like I said, I've got some fundings there, and what I'm looking for is if we come up with the right formula, that I'm willing to fund it, but on a 50-50 basis with the government. So we need to get some of our people along to talk to the politicians. I think one of the politicians there has been around the regions for a hell of a long time. The brother from up in Western Australia, Pat Dodson. I think we should be speaking to him and more and I think that's the way to go. But forget about the voice to Parliament. It's been set up by academics, and none of our people on the bloody ground, the grassroots people, don't understand what it's all about. Thank you.
So, Nulsa, do you think there needs to be wide-based consultations around any treaty proposal?
Well, definitely. That's why I'm trying to put my money up to actually hold some sort of a get together in Sydney, or Canberra, or wherever the group agree on, and put a position up to actually put to Parliament. and we work together on it.
Thanks, Nulsa. I'd like to introduce Geoff Clark, former elected leader of ATSIC, to give his views on the National Treaty Alliance. Thanks, Geoff.
Thanks, Kuchi, and everybody else tuned in. I just want to make some comments in relation to referendums and my particular view and take on the 1967 referendum. The 1967 referendum had firstly two roles. One was to count us within the census. Two, it gave power to the federal government to make laws for Aboriginal people. Now, we must think about that federal power to make laws. And I think going back to Michael's discussion, why would we need another referendum to empower Aboriginal people when you could argue that the law already resides with the Parliament? When you consider that even back in 67, there was a 90% turnout by non-Indigenous people, that is white people, to support what they thought was best for Aboriginal people. Although Aboriginal people campaigned, but if you've done the analysis, why wouldn't you be campaigning for a better deal? And that's what they were back in 67. They thought by getting some rights, and I lived through some of that in 67 on the reserves. My grandmother couldn't find work opportunities. My uncles, etc., had to travel, and they never had a permit to get off the reserve. So you would have thought that they would have argued pretty strongly for something that was not totally effectual for Aboriginal people, because, back then I think the issue was sovereignty and land rights and traditional ownership seems to be, a dream away. Like, it was very difficult to envisage governments making those bold type stands and even treaties. So the fundamental outcome of 67 was that white people decided what was best for black people. Fast forward to 2022, what's the difference with the voice? We're going to a referendum where white people, 90% again or 97% again, will determine what is best for Aboriginal people. Now, for those of us who are on this podcast, and others, there's been a long history of going to international forums to try and change these things. And one of the things we did come up with was the Universal Declaration of Indigenous Peoples' Rights. And that talks about free and informed consent. And I noticed, in the treaty document that Victoria is proposing, etc., the UNDRIP, if you call it, there's a shortening of that. The UNDRIP says we have to adhere to those principles. Why is that principle being thrown out the door? Because there will not be an informed consent, even though a successful referendum may get up, because it's got very little to do with how we cast our vote, because being 3%, it's irrelevant. Yet they will decide how this process affects our sovereignty. And you may have to think about, well, there's been a mandate. There's been discussions about a mandate. Well, I'm looking on my wall here and I'm reading the Uluru Statement. That was a mandate, an aspirational document. And I would have thought that most black people around the country at the time, back in 88, etc., would have supported that statement, and probably still do, some of the principles. But it was, again, another aspirational document that doesn't necessarily define the relationship in this country. And as Michael just earlier pointed out, the only way you do that and can do that is not through a legislative voice that has no power and has no resources, and a promise that those things will be added. Who's going to fall for that? I wouldn't have thought many white people would dive into the over the cliff to support a concept that seems to have no basis in terms of its detail, because they seem to be, those advocating are reluctant. The other point about that is that I was at Uluru, and sure, we endorsed a aspirational document. It had no detail, but we thought that would come. Well, I'm on the Uluru working group, along with about another 25, 30 other people. We've had no capacity to meet. We were mandated, just like if people like Noel and Megan and others think that they enjoy a mandate from Uluru, well, surely we are the people who've carried that mandate, yet there is no consultation, no negotiation, no process. We're engaged to try and find detail that will assist that aspirational document. So the process, in short, is flawed. One of the other things I think that concerns me about a lot of these discussions, like sovereignty, Aboriginal identity, and Michael raised it with one of these senators from Tasmania. This self-identity, what process is it that you identify? Is it self-identification? Is it community endorsement in order to be black? Or is it government lists like the census counts, university? I've heard people talk from universities who are saying that, there's an enormous amount of numbers of people who self-identifying. Back in the day, there were three elements to self-identification. There was bloodline, there was acceptance by local community, there was self-identification, and you would have to provide proof, apical ancestor, you were part of a group, people knew who you come from. Also, you needed to be, I think back then, because I live on a former reserve, like the brother boy there up at Yarrabah, we live in a collective society. So we know our members. We can function as a group of people. Yet these people who are recently identifying are probably going off the census list, a doctor's tick in a box, a university tick, and it's really proving to become a real problem. Because as a collective society, it is outside of our jurisdiction. And, when you get down to the treaty negotiations, or as we are here in Victoria, who sits at the table? Those people who are self-identifying. We've got so many people who are now running for, there are a number of people in Victoria running for state parliament seats who have only recently identified. So, it makes government look good. Oh, yeah, we've got an Aboriginal representation. But how does that function? How does that control? How does that, in terms of your territorial integrity, how does people relate back to their territory, communities? We have the cooperatives, and we have, the natural organisations, the national, we've had health services, we've had land councils, and that was some form of structure where we could look at our membership and then acknowledge that those people were knowledge holders, they carried knowledge, they were law people, or they were community people who understood Aboriginal society. It seems to me that I think this is a growing concern. That is, I notice on, I get on a bit of Twitter, I notice that people are now starting to raise it. But where are the forums for those sorts of matters to be discussed, defined, acknowledged, and go forward? The other one is, I suppose, the last one, which I'll finish on, is the elders. You know, the elders are the knowledge holders. How is the elders being defined? You've got self-identifiers. There must be some sort of universal acceptance process whereby I think we have some internal authority, governance, if you like, recognition of these people in our states, in our communities, or nationally. So, the issue of identity, I agree with Michael, is becoming extremely difficult. That's the issue that, I'm reading the framework agreement in Victoria, and it's going to be an enormous task because, we're facing this in our native title application now. We have people who are, I call them book entries. They've never associated with the community. For 60, 80 years, I've never known those people's ancestors. I've never known them to be active in Aboriginal affairs, yet they are putting in claims. So, it raises a real issue. Back in the day, as I said, we had some structure to our membership and our organisation that represented us. That seems to be becoming watered down, and I think it's a real problem, Kuchi. I'm sure there's a solution at some point, but my other point is that we don't have the forums, like ATSIC. We had treaty, we had a process of treaty. We started to sit down and work through these issues. But what it seems to me, when I look at these frameworks, it's government dictating how a treaty may be rolled out, how you may comply with the legislation. It's a bit of an issue.
My name's Les Malzer. I'm currently chairperson of the Foundation for Aboriginal and Islander Research Action, which we prefer to call FAIRA. But my previous role was as the co-chair of National Congress of Australia's First Peoples. And I wanted to point that out because, like Geoff Clark, we were elected to our positions to represent Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples at the national level. And I think that's very important in terms of what motivates us and what we pursue as being our priorities. I'll also add that my strongest background is probably the work at the United Nations, particularly leading up to the development of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So a lot of my time in Australia now is trying to get those rights into law in the Australian legal system. So, of course, this direction of Statement from the Heart of having voice, truth and treaty is an important one, and along with closing the gap, seems to have consumed the national agenda. And I hope this is the first of a number of podcasts that people will be able to access to learn more about the treaty process and what's important to pursue. Now, first thing is, the treaty seems to be on everyone's lips as the answer and the hope for the future, but it has no definition. People are saying, look, we want a treaty and so on. And what's motivating our mob is to say we want to be in a position of power to be able to negotiate our interests, our futures, to ensure that our continued survival into the future is guaranteed by us, and not that we're slowly assimilated into the dominant colonising societies. So the talk of a treaty is a call for empowerment and for strength. And let me add to that by, I think it's a call for national unity. And that's something Michael touched on a bit at the beginning, that we don't want to have states and territories now resuming roles and responsibilities that existed before Whitlam came in after the 67 referendum and said Aboriginal affairs will be a national responsibility. And I point that out because the rights of Indigenous peoples is a national responsibility. It's not responsibility of state governments, of local governments, of other areas. It's a national responsibility, and that's where the rights have to be entrenched, not bits and pieces here and there, depending on where you live. And a treaty, I believe, is what people are saying will get us there. But I think the first thing we've got to learn when we talk about treaty in these podcasts is that treaties have been there over history between the colonisers and Indigenous peoples. And they've been mainly for the benefit of the, well, almost entirely for the benefit of the colonisers, so that they can continue to do what they're doing. And that is exploiting the lands and the resources of the people in the Americas, in the Pacific, and elsewhere in the world that they want for the European powers. So treaties also, we know historically, come along with promises, that is, broken promises. So we've got to think seriously when we talk about a treaty, and I'm a big advocate for treaty, we've got to think seriously, are we opening up the door to broken promises? You know, the Trail of Tears, that the government turned around saying, well, you wanted a treaty and here you go. You know, you didn't get what you wanted in there, but you've got it. So we've got to be very careful, and we've got to be committed. Now, the first thing that is important is that a treaty has to be an initiative of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, right? It's got to be something we pushed, and it's been that way. Kevin Gilbert wrote about this in his book when he said, because a white man will never do it. And that's exactly the message. A treaty should just be called by our people because a white person, white man, or whatever we want to say, won't do it unless they're forced to do it. And we have to put as much pressure into that's going on there. So it has to be our initiative. Kevin Gilbert started it. There was this Aboriginal Treaty Committee in the 1970s that a book came out by Stuart Harris called It's Coming Yet, setting out details of what a treaty might do and the possibilities and so on. There's been other publications, and of course ATSIC under the leadership of Geoff Clark in, I think it was 2002, published a book and a number of brochures and pamphlets about treaty and about the voice being heard. And it's all in there, it's all been done. So coming from the Statement from the Heart and coming from the New Dawn Labor government for a treaty is not new in the process. It was our voice, and it was us pushing for that result. But who's talking about treaty now? Who's taking the lead on it now? The answer is not National Congress, not ATSIC, not any of the other advocates of the Kevin Gilbert and people of the past. It's government. And it's the government talking about treaty and how it will proceed. And the voices that seem to be involved in there are coming from what is now popularly being known as the Canberra bubble. That is that there's something happening down there in that sort of sheltered centre, which is supposed to be where our future hopes and so on lie, but they're not coming from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. They're not coming from what we are demanding and what we're committing. So how do we avoid a false treaty and broken promises? Well, the first thing, we've got to have preconditions. We've got to say treaties have to be involved on the rights of Indigenous peoples, the ones that are accepted around the world in the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And those rights have to be in law. They have to be embodied in law to be part of a treaty agreement. In the Statement from the Heart, the first half of that statement was talking about Aboriginal people's sovereignty never ceded. And that's got to be the way in which we walk to the table on treaty, is that sovereignty exists. Now, there might be legal advocates saying, oh, you don't have sovereignty, you've lost it all, you've been conquered, etc. But that's not the way we'll walk to the table. We'll walk to the table saying we are sovereign, we have the right to demand our future. And that picks up on a little bit on what Mike Mansell said, which I'd like to touch on here. And that is about one seat for each state in the Senate, because the Senate is the House of the states. It was deliberately created in the Constitution. Instead of a House of Lords, there was the Senate in Australia was created to give each state equal treatment. So Tasmania, the size of Tasmania and its population, has an equal say in the Senate to New South Wales, which is the most populous state in Australia, and Victoria, you know, who probably between them account for half of the population of Australia. But you know, there are 6 states represented in the Senate, and the idea that perhaps there should be a 7th state or 7th form of representation, in this case 1 seat per state for Indigenous people, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, makes a lot of sense put in that context, because it shouldn't just be the 6 colonies that are represented in the upper house in Australian Parliament. It should be the First Peoples as well as those other places, those states. So that's something that is a very sound basis for existence. I know it's not in the Constitution as such, but at the same time, there's nothing in the Constitution that prohibits that. It just simply means that each state can themselves say one of the seats they want to be included to be from people chosen by the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Other prerequisites, well, there's quite a few of them, and hopefully our future podcasts will start to go through those. Michael's mentioned some of them, but one of the things I wanted to mention there is that, and looking at the Queensland's proposal to have a treaty and what they put out recently in recent months, they see that being something argued between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and the non-Indigenous community of Queensland. Well, that's a disaster. It's something argued between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and the Parliament, which represents the state, all right? Because we know what happens when we get put up against, we're 3%, when we get put up against the other 97% of the population. Those of you who were around during the days of the Northern Territory Land Rights Act will know about the signs going up at the petrol station saying any Aboriginal person coming into this area will be shot on sight, and that sort of thing. That was a reaction to land rights. And you'll also remember the reaction to the native title legislation, where, you know, a number of people complaining to me personally about walking into the newspaper shop to pick up a newspaper and somebody walking up and said, "You're not going to be taking my backyard," and that sort of thing, threatening Aboriginal people from the public going to buy a newspaper. So this is not an argument. A treaty is not an argument to have with that bitter, marginalised section of the community who want to come to the forefront, you know, do the Donald Trump stuff, march on Parliament and everything else. Our argument is with the Parliament, which represents the peoples of Australia. We want an agreement made with them. So we have to be very, very careful that the way in which a treaty is pitched is not where the government says, well, okay, look, you've got us convinced, go out there now and convince the white people. And if you come back with their agreement, then we'll go ahead. Parliament has to deal with the problem they're going to have, the sort of backlash they're going to have about all this. It's their responsibility. They tried to do it in 1991 with the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation to say by 2001, we want to have a reconciliation agreement in Australia to represent 100 years of federation. And what happened? John Howard's plan, 10-point plan. These are the things that I'll accept, nothing else. And so I doubt anybody has ever heard of that report that came out of that 10 years of work put into that reconciliation, because in there, one of the top things in there was treaty. There needs to be a treaty. And going back to what I originally said, the treaty is an empowered arrangement made as equals at the table with the state. And that's why the rights have to be respected. That's why sovereignty has to be respected. Now, let me point out some of the things that need to be considered in the treaty. The process to get there, and Michael mentioned the commission, in this case, I'll say the Makarrata Commission. I'm comfortable with that name myself. And that needs to be in place as an independent body. It will be a statutory authority one way or another. But at the same time, it can't feel that it is answerable to the minister, which was the way ATSEC was made to feel in the last few years, that they answered to the minister instead of answering to the Board of Commissioners elected by the people. So whatever it is, as a commission or a judiciary body of some sort, they have to be able to be answerable to Aboriginal peoples in some form or other. And there will be some legal problems about getting that into place. Again, to avoid that argument that I said before about where our fight becomes one with the person on the street at the newspaper shop. That's got to be handled by the white community, not by the black community on the whole thing. And it's a minority of people, it might be 10% of agitators who are willing to get out there physically and threaten and so on, but we're only 3%. And we want to be safe and secure in pursuing our rights as well about all of that. Now, some other notes I've got points to make here in this brief comment is about, we do have an example with the Torres Strait Treaty, which is worth looking at because it recognises the rights of traditional owners. It's between two nations, between Australia and Papua New Guinea, and it has some interesting things in there which have taken the world stage. It's been used in other places about negotiating in those difficult conditions of where there's traditional interests that lie around. And one of the things I'm suggesting is that the Prime Minister, having made his commitment on election night to full implementation of Statement from the Heart, needs to be making a statement of commitment, like Paul Keating did in the Redfern speech. Needs to be making a personal commitment to a treaty, not saying, oh, we'll support it and leaving it then to future governments with their thing. He's got to make a full statement of commitment, like they said for sorry business, for the apology to the Parliament, where both sides of the Parliament got up and made statements on the day, and it was a big event and so on. The statement of commitment to a treaty has to come from a parliamentary basis led by the Prime Minister on it, and that's the onus upon the New Dawn Labor. And I'll finish up soon. I think time's running short. I think I've covered most of the points I really wanted to get in here, but as I said, we can't just presume a treaty will deliver what we want. I think we've seen a really bad result with native title, and when agreements have been signed off by people so that they get some recognition as being the traditional owners, but they don't get exclusive rights to their lands and territories. They get the same rights as the beekeepers and the fishermen and the campers and four-wheel drivers and so on. So we have to make sure that when a treaty is signed, when a document is signed, that we're not signing away rights. We're actually putting rights into motion and into effect. I'll leave it at this because I think these are the sorts of things that need to be stretched out with future podcasts, and I hope that we can build a following on that. Thank you.
I've just got a couple of brief points. So do you see a treaty commission being a permanent commission on Australia's political landscape?
Look, in fact, one of the things that I think should be in a treaty is a mechanism for monitoring the treaty and following up on it. So I think a commission, in this case, leading up to a treaty, might be overtaken by a body that's agreed to in the treaty itself. And I wanted to make a reference. There's 3 articles in the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which says that there has to be an independent mechanism agreed to by the state and by the Indigenous peoples to monitor disputes between the state and Indigenous peoples. It can't be, as we know in Australia, where any dispute, any legal right, any complaint we have goes to the government. And we're complaining about the government, but we have to go to the government to get it resolved. So there are 3 areas in there which talk about autonomous monitoring, where Indigenous peoples have an equal place to it. So it's an early question. Let's see how it develops with the Commission. But certainly, I think the treaty, once it's in place, gets overtaken by the mechanism that people install into that thing, agreed to by the state, agreed to by Indigenous peoples, then to see how we are going. The Torres Strait Treaty has something like that, for example.
Look, a lot of the work's been done, and the knowledge of that is being held by probably elders in communities now. And as we know, many of them have passed on. I think one of the things that may assist, and one of the advantages of ATSIC, being the ex-chair, one of the advantages that we had plenty of dialogue amongst ourselves. We had resources and sometimes no resources, but we sat around at various forums, whether they were local, national or statewide or even internationally, and we had dialogue about these issues, and we informed ourselves, you know, particularly through the Land Council structure back in the day and the NACHOs, the health organisations. That political debate needs to occur at the community level. I really believe that, you know, we often criticise our youth for not taking up the battle, but information is gold. And I think that, you know, promoting dialogue and discussion, which can be done at any particular point, at any place. And if we can assist that, and maybe that's something we talk about, how we assist communities to gather the information, have the discussion, have the dialogue, and, you know, manifest a position, a strong position nationally, whereby we tackle some of these matters, because, you know, they come around these issues, you know, like I said, like there are statements like Kalkaringi, you know, the Barunga Statement, Eva Valley Statement, you know, all those statements came about by people deciding to get to a central point, have lots of dialogue and come out with our position. This is no different, and I think that's probably what's lacking, and I think that would be useful in the future.
As my fellow speakers have mentioned, the federal government have a responsibility to find a way for ordinary Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders to become involved in this process, but they're shut out. It's a very elitist movement at the moment, where a very select group have access to resources, to the government and to the media. And the rest of Aboriginal people around the country are just sitting back and wondering what's going on. So the government must find a way to provide access for ordinary Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islanders to make comment. And while they're funding 75 million in favour of an idea, where are the resources so that those Aboriginal people who have got very good reasons for opposing the idea can also have their say? And at the moment, the government's shutting them out.
What I spoke about earlier on, that, you know, that the organisation I've worked for are willing to put up some funds to get the core group together, maybe in Sydney or wherever best suited, and collate all this information that we have today. And look like nobody else is going to do it but ourselves, or, you know, with the good group together who you know, who's really like knows the history and all that sort of thing. So that's what I'm offering here, that we get together and then we can, you know, form a mandate that we can take to the government and make use of Dodson and Bernie and the rest of the Aboriginal politicians in Parliament, in the federal Parliament.
Anyway, just from the group, Kuchi and Melissa and others, thanks very much for your effort. I think it's been taken a while to get something like this started, and let's hope that it grows. From little things, big things grow.